Hey everybody, welcome to my new series simply called 10 RPG Recommendations. And if you haven't guessed by the title, I'm going to be doing these recommendations by system and chronologically. So we're starting with the NES and the Famicom. But before we get into this, I just want to point out that this is not a top 10 list. It's not a top 10 list of the best games on the NES or the Famicom. It's simply 10 recommendations for RPGs you might not have heard of or you may have heard of that I think are good and should get a little attention. That's it. I don't like top 10 lists. I think, they're kind of played out. Anybody can do one and they all end up kind of being similar. So you don't need me to tell you that Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy are good RPGs on the NES. You don't need that. There's 100 other videos on YouTube that will tell you that. So if you want to see the same old list, feel free to find one. This is not it. So anyway, from there, we'll just jump right into this. So we'll look at our first game.
Crystalis, known in Japan by the much more awesome name Godslayer Haruka Tenku no Sonata, which translates as something like Godslayer, Sonata of the Distant Ether. Way better. Anyway, it was developed by SNK and released in 1990 for the Famicom and the NES. And while Crystalis is actually a post-apocalyptic action RPG, the game actually seems more like a fantasy RPG as the main weapons are swords and magic, though the magic is more similar to psionics than your standard magic system. The game, while playing similarly to Zelda, is actually quite a bit more complex due to a varied rock, paper, scissors type combat that makes use of 4 elements: wind, water, fire, and thunder. And it has an experience-based leveling system. What's great about Crystalis, though, is that it's taken the format set down by a game like The Legend of Zelda and improved upon it. First, there's an actual story beyond collect this, save that. In fact, the story of Crystalis is quite interesting and dark. Characters die, locations are obliterated, and there are other significant twists. Not only that, the bosses are appropriately difficult. For action RPGs on the NES, it doesn't get much better than Crystalis.
So have you ever wondered what would happen if you took Phantasy Star and Dragon Quest and Megami Tensei and you put them together in a dark, quiet room and they somehow made sweet love? So only me then. Okay, well, I'll roll with that. So imagine this scenario. Imagine if that happened. I think the game you'd have would be Lagrange Point.
Lagrange Point is a sci-fi turn-based RPG that was released in 1991 by Konami. It's in my opinion one of the best looking RPGs on the Famicom, but not only that. Thanks to being the only game to use the Konami VRC-7 chip, it's also one of the best sounding games on the system. The gameplay follows a very similar to Dragon Quest style battle system with first-person battles with, except for bosses and a few sub-bosses, static enemies. Though I will mention that the sides of the battle areas are lit up and animated, so it's almost like fighting battles while riding Space Mountain or something. It's pretty interesting. Beyond that though, the game still manages to do enough right to make it stand out. The story is more grown up and complex than most other RPGs on the Famicom at the time. There's a deep conspiracy plot involving mutant attacks on space stations. There's also multiple side characters and twists that keep the story interesting and engaging. There are also different types of characters including humans, cyborgs, and robots. One of the coolest and most addicting parts of the game is the weapon fusion system. Like Megami Tensei's Demon Fusion, weapons in this game can be fused together to make new, stronger weapons. Not only that, each weapon has its own animation and sound effect, which is pretty cool. It's not as in-depth or complicated as the demon summoning in Megami Tensei, but it's pretty fun nonetheless. If you don't mind a lot of random battles and grinding, then this should definitely fill a need for a quality sci-fi RPG on the Famicom. Much like other PC ports such as the Bard's Tale, the NES port of this game looks hideous compared to essentially any other version released. Gone were the 1988 DOS graphics I was used to, and in their place were some of the worst NES graphics ever. Then again, if you're currently interested in NES RPGs, you're probably not here for graphics, are you? Luckily, this game excels in every other way possible. It's based entirely on the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition rules, and allows you to create tons of different combinations of character classes, including multi-classes, and races from the Forgotten Realms setting. Game plays like a standard first-person dungeon crawler for the most part, except when combat comes around. Unlike games like The Bard's Tale, which uses a kind of stationary character portrait-type battle system, Pool of Radiance moves to a top-down, turn-based strategy-type battle system. I will warn you though, this game is pretty hard. It's not for anyone but the most hardcore of RPG players. This is the most complex, most difficult, and ultimately most satisfying RPG experience you can have on the NES. Not only that, it's old school enough that you'll almost definitely need a pad of grid paper nearby to map any dungeon you go into. There's no auto mapping here. However, if you like your RPGs hardcore and the difficulty high, there's no better choice on the NES than Pool of Radiance.
So, not all RPGs on this system are serious or overly complex. There are some more lighter fare that are definitely worth playing.
Momotaro Densetsu is one of those games that blew up in Japan. It was developed by Hudson and originally released in 1987. It's an RPG based on the Japanese legend of Momotaro, and it follows the legend pretty closely. The game itself, though, is very much like a Dragon Quest, but with a legendary Japanese skin. However, what sets it apart from being just another Dragon Quest clone is that it's full of jokes and gags and has a really goofy tone to the whole game. The game even took elements from jokes from the popular television shows at the time, which helped its popularity. Not only is there an overlying theme of goofiness, the traditional RPG elements have been, in a sense, Japanified. For example, enemies tend to be Japanese-style monsters like Oni, and RPG standards like experience, hit points, and magic points have been swapped out with spirit, body, and technique respectively. Gold is placed with Ryo, which is an obsolete Japanese currency. What I enjoy about Momotaro Densetsu is that it has familiar gameplay, but with a setting that's different from the standard fantasy RPG of the time. It's also a lot less serious, and a lot more goofy and ridiculous than other RPGs.
So the next game we're going to look at is something a little different. It's a Japanese RPG, but it's not like Dragon Quest. And it's an action RPG, but it's not like Zelda. It's a rather unique and actually quite good-looking game.
Esper Dream 2 is an action RPG released by Konami in 1992. And is of course a sequel to Esper Dream on the Famicom Disk System. Unlike the first game though, which is also quite good, the game isn't based on dreams so much as it's about entering Book World. You have a main hub area that consists of a library, and there are 4 book worlds to explore. Alright, there's actually 5, but one of them you can't actually enter. The game looks great though for a Famicom game. It's colorful and the sprites look good, and the music is great thanks to use of the Konami VRC6 chip, which is also used in Castlevania 3 and Madara. The RPG elements, beyond the standard weapon and item collection, and experience and leveling system, also include world-specific quests and an optional world-specific sidekick, as well as a separate story for each area. There are no random battles in Esper Dream 2. Enemies on the map are represented by footprints on the screen and can be avoided. When battle begins, a separate battle area is used. Battle itself is action-oriented with projectile weapons, mainly a gun, but there are others including a bow and a bazooka. Being one of the later Famicom releases, it never received an NES port. It doesn't quite have the fame that it deserves, as it's still a fun and interesting RPG on the Famicom.
So what would an RPG recommendation list be without a strategy RPG? Incomplete, obviously, so let's look at one.
While the first Fire Emblem game on the Famicom is a great game and comes highly recommended, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I prefer Fire Emblem Gaiden. It's not really a popular opinion, as it introduces a lot of new things that the original and most of the sequels didn't have. But, in my opinion, out of the first two games, Fire Emblem Gaiden is the superior version. Now why do I say that? Well, there's a few reasons. First, the Fire Emblem Gaiden introduces the branching class system, so it's much more customizable. It also allows you to deploy all of your troops to a battle as opposed to having a deploy limit like the first Fire Emblem, so you can have huge armies on your side instead of a limited amount. There's also an overworld type exploration system that wasn't in the first game. Not only that, the game allowed you to replay battles in order to grind levels for your characters. For me, this is almost an essential function. For every SRPG I play, I always do each level twice. It's like a ritual. So, allowing me to do that in Fire Emblem Gaiden, bonus points. A lot of these changes didn't make it into the other games in the series though, so despite looking quite similar to the original game, and actually reusing a lot of sprites, it has a lot of extra charm to it due to the major differences in gameplay. Definitely give Fire Emblem Gaiden a chance.
One thing you're going to quickly notice about this series of RPG recommendations is that I'm a complete sucker for post-apocalyptic RPG settings. And, again, here is another good one. On this list, there's 3 post-apocalyptic RPGs. On every list forward, there's at least one. Here's another.
In 1991, the first in the start of a great series of post-apocalyptic RPGs was released. Metal Max for the Famicom. The game itself is reminiscent of the Final Fantasy games in that you travel around an overworld and battles are fought in a third-person turn-based way. However, instead of character classes as such, you have preset characters that can be used as fighters with weapons, or in what's the coolest part of the series, vehicles. The game is essentially a vehicle combat RPG, and a lot of what you're doing focuses on upgrading and repairing vehicles while hunting monsters and collecting bounties. Another interesting thing is that the game is non-linear and open-ended. You can hunt bounties and go anywhere in any order you choose. You can also continue the game even after the final story is finished in case you want to search for more bounties or tank upgrades. If you are interested in non-linear and interesting RPG on the Famicom, this one is a perfect choice, though the only reason I can think of not to play it is that you'd probably rather play the remake on the Super Famicom. In that case, I guess I could accept that excuse.
Generally, when you think of games made for movies, you're probably not thinking about quality games. And you're probably not thinking about RPGs either, especially on the Famicom. But there is a case where the Famicom game surpasses the movie, and even sort of starts its own genre. And that would be the Capcom classic 1989's Sweet Home.
First, the writer and director of the movie Sweet Home supervised the production of the game. This is important when that writer and director is Japanese horror master Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who created some of my favorite Japanese horror movies, including Cure, Cairo, and Doppelganger. The game itself is an example of greatness. The story is awesome, the overall gameplay really helps to build the horror elements. It's essentially a survival horror RPG. First, there are no item drops, money, magic, or shops. Everything takes place in a mansion, and healing items are limited to what you find, and are finite. Not only that, death of characters is permanent. There are no Phoenix Downs here. Your total party consists of 5 people, but is split into 2 parties. Each character has a special item they can use, and some strategy is required when forming your parties, which can only have a maximum of 3 people. It's always necessary to be very cautious with a smaller party to avoid huge damage and death. Enemies are suitably strong and horrific, though not super varied. I don't want to go off on an actual review of this game. It would take longer than I want to allow for this video, but this game gets my highest recommendation. If you haven't played Sweet Home, please do. I'd be hard-pressed to recommend a better RPG on the Famicom.
There are some aspects of RPGs that I really enjoy. I really enjoy leveling up and customizing characters, finding secrets, plus interesting stories, interesting worlds. These kinds of things really grab me about RPGs. I especially like RPGs with punishing difficulty. That's why the Megami Tensei series is really targeted for me.
On the Famicom, we have two entries in the series, Megami Tensei and Megami Tensei II. The first is based on a novel series, but the second is not based on the novel series and has its own unique story. It is another post-apocalyptic RPG involving remnants of humans living in bunkers. If you aren't familiar with this style of game, it's, for the most part, a first-person dungeon crawler with a third-person overworld. The key part of the game is the ability to gather and fuse demons to fight alongside you. Much like Esper Dream 2, the graphics are updated from the first game, and the music is spectacular thanks to a special chip. In this case, the Namco 163 WSG chip. Here's a sample. Just listen. Greatness. Of course, due to heavy religious themes and a more adult story, this one had no chance of ever getting released outside of Japan. Still the kind of thing that would cause trouble with religious groups considering the types of bosses in the game. Yahweh, for example, is a possibility. Really, I can talk about this game and the series for hours. The gameplay is classic dungeon crawling mixed with a high difficulty and addictive demon fusing. Like Metal Max, the only reason you shouldn't play this game is if you're holding out to play the Super Famicom remake.
Though Japanese developed RPGs are well represented on the NES and the Famicom, one of the greatest and most influential computer RPGs of the time was also ported to the system in 1987.
In my opinion, Ultima Exodus is a game that any RPG fan should play. It's pretty much the foundation for RPGs as we know them today. It has a party creation element that was taken from Wizardry, an overworld with enemy encounters, towns and castles, first-person dungeons with secret treasures and special item drops, third-person battle sequence on a grid, and various magic and weapon attacks. Ultima, and also Wizardry, have a direct and obvious influence on Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy and pretty much every RPG afterwards, directly or indirectly. The original was released on the Apple II and various other systems in 1983, though the NES version didn't come out until 1987. The game does have a bit of combat that is somewhat difficult at first, but once your characters start to level up, the battles become much easier, and the story itself starts to focus more on solving puzzles in order to further strengthen characters and to actually reach the final boss of the game. There's an interesting combination of overworld exploration and first-person dungeon crawling with various puzzles that have to be solved and secret locations that have to be found. I remember playing this game for hours and hours as a kid to grind levels and search dungeons for treasure. The story is interesting and the puzzles and world are great to experience. Another thing that I want to mention about Ultima Exodus is that, unlike other ports of computer RPGs on the NES, this version actually looks better than the original. Though, admittedly, the original graphics were almost stick figures. Despite the old school sensibilities of this Western RPG, it's still enjoyable and playable today. If anything, this is one you should experience just to see the basic roots of console RPGs and to also experience one of the great classics on the NES.
So that'll conclude my 10 NES/Famicom recommendations, and I hope you guys found something interesting in the video. And next time, we're going to be looking at a system that's near and dear to my heart. That would be the TurboGrafx 16 and the PC Engine. So until then, see you next time.